Is Taiwan part of China? What is the country's historic relation to the province? We'll discuss these questions and more on this week's China Report. Welcome to the China Report, a new show produced in collaboration with Pivot to Peace. Every week, we'll be helping you sort through the propaganda with an independent view of the country that we're taught to hate, but know so little about. I'm your host, Amanda Yee. This is my co-host, KJ Noh. KJ, why don't you get us started with this week's headlines?
China demonstrates economic strength by issuing dollar-denominated bonds at near U.S. Treasury rates. China issued $2 billion worth of bonds in U.S. dollars in two tranches at 4.284% and 4.34% interest in Saudi Arabia. These interest rates were 0.01% and 0.03% higher than U.S. Treasuries, making them directly competitive with U.S. Treasury bonds. More importantly, demand for these Chinese bonds was 20 times higher than supply, approximately 7 to 10 times higher than for U.S. Treasuries. This high demand and low interest rate signals strong confidence in China's ability to fulfill a signal of Chinese economic strength. It also demonstrates China's capacity to insert itself as a middleman in dollar circulation, challenging the US's exorbitant privilege to issue debt or control liquidity. The symbolism of issuing the bonds in Saudi Arabia, the center of the petrodollar recycling system that undergirds the US dollar's privilege as an unlimited credit card, was also noted by many financial experts.
The Chinese government is cracking down on apps exploiting delivery drivers. The Office of the Central Cyberspace Affairs Commission announced a new campaign on Sunday, broadly targeting algorithmic manipulation by tech companies. As part of this, the campaign will address delivery driver exploitation. The commission released a statement emphasizing the need to prevent internet platforms from blindly pursuing profits at the expense of workers providing these in-app services. The number of those workers surpassed 84 million in China as of 2023 and includes food delivery drivers, ride-hailing drivers, and couriers. The statement stressed the importance of preventing platforms from excessively reducing delivery times, which leads to more frequent delivery delays, traffic violations, and accidents. Platforms are now required to clearly disclose algorithm rules for time estimation, fee calculation, and route planning. They must also promptly handle appeals from workers regarding delivery delays caused by uncontrollable factors such as traffic and bad weather. And the long-standing issue of big data discrimination, where platforms use algorithms to implement differential pricing based on user characteristics such as age, occupation, and consumption level, will now be prohibited.
China demonstrates potential surgical cure for Alzheimer's disease. Chinese researchers demonstrated a potential cure for Alzheimer's using super microsurgery to improve the flow of cerebrospinal fluid within the cranial glymphatic system, the paravascular fluid system that is hypothesized to remove the amyloid beta plaque implicated in Alzheimer's disease. Promising results were shown starting 5 weeks after the surgery in one case for a 70-year-old woman. 4 months after the surgery, the patient's daughter stated, "My mother's memory is stabilizing and improving, and she's able to complete household chores every day."
Cubans in China celebrated Fidel Castro's legacy yesterday. This past Monday, November 25th, marked 8 years since the Cuban revolutionary passed away. Members of the Cuban diplomatic mission in China paid tribute with flowers and an audiovisual presentation and recalled passages from Castro's life. The diplomats also highlighted Castro's relations with China, including his visits to the nation in 1995 and 2003, which helped to increase political trust between the two parties. Cuba was the first country in the Western Hemisphere to establish relations with the PRC. In October, the Biden administration approved $2 billion of arms sales to Taiwan, a move swiftly denounced by Beijing. This arms package follows another $567 million military package Biden approved just a month before in September. In Xi's meeting with Biden last week in Lima, he outright stated that U.S. support for Taiwan independence was crossing a clear red line, that cross-strait stability and so-called Taiwan independence were irreconcilable, that if the U.S. were serious about maintaining peace in the Taiwan Strait, it would support peaceful reunification of China, a clear warning to the incoming Trump administration. In the US, we know little of Taiwan, except as a staging ground for a possible military confrontation with China. But what is Taiwan's historic relation to China? Is Taiwan part of China? To discuss this, we're honored to have on Charles Xu, a member of Qiao Collective. Qiao Collective is a diaspora Chinese media collective challenging US aggression on China. Charles, welcome to the China Report.
Thanks so much for having me on. It's a pleasure to be here.
Yeah, we're really happy to have you on. Maybe to get right into it, we should lay the foundation for this discussion. You know, Taiwan, US backs independence. China maintains that Taiwan is a part of China, that the question of Taiwan is a Chinese matter, and that the US should just stay out of it and shouldn't be involved at all. So let's lay the foundation for this discussion. There is confusion among people in the US about whether or not Taiwan is actually a part of China, but correct me if I'm wrong, but historically the island has always belonged to China, and it was actually taken from China after it lost the Sino-Japanese War, and it was taken by Japan in 1895. So maybe to start, could you briefly go over the history of Taiwan and its historical relation to China?
Yeah, absolutely. I guess to preface, I'll note that we here at Qiao Collective put out a very exhaustive timeline and resource list on our website about Taiwan. So, what I'm saying is basically drawn from that, and there's a lot more detail there. That said, Taiwan has been inhabited by humans for millennia, right? But for our purposes, the important thing is that, as long as we've had a world system of sovereign states, Taiwan has been internationally recognized as part of China by all other countries in that system for that entire history of the last several centuries, with the exception of the 50-year period of Japanese colonization, which lasted from 1895 to 1945. And, in particular, in 1945, after the defeat of Japan in World War II, Taiwan was officially ceded back to the Republic of China government, which at the time was the legal government of all of China. And again, this was, a move that was well entrenched in international law, that was recognized by all countries on the planet. And in fact, it remains the case today that every country on earth recognizes Taiwan as part of China. And indeed, the de facto government of Taiwan itself, which continues to call itself the Republic of China, also officially recognizes that fact. So, you sometimes see in the mainstream media coverage of this, so some formulation like 11 or 12 countries on Earth, recognize Taiwan or have diplomatic relations with Taiwan, and in fact, that's actually shorthand for an official position on the part of that dwindling set of countries that the authorities based in Taipei are the quote unquote legitimate government of all of China, including the mainland. So, this has its origins, of course, in the Chinese Civil War, where the, extremely corrupt, extremely authoritarian US-backed right-wing nationalist regime of Chiang Kai-shek, which ruled the Republic of China, lost the Civil War, in particular during that last 4-year period from 1945 to 1949, and then fled to Taiwan, where it continued to assert that it was the legitimate government of all of China. And this was a claim at the time backed by the United States and most of its allies, in the context of the Cold War. And the thing is that, the United States in particular has sort of been the driving force here, in terms of, on the one hand, switching over diplomatic recognition from the Republic of China, ROC regime in Taiwan, to the People's Republic of China, with its capital in Beijing, and officially hewing to what they call a one China policy. But at the same time, sort of talking out of both sides of its mouth and, endorsing this new trend in the past few decades of really pushing the Taiwan independence movement locally in Taiwan, because with the end of the Cold War, right, with the end of one-party nationalist or Kuomintang rule in Taiwan, suddenly their claim to represent free China as opposed to red China on the mainland has lost its ideological effect. And so, in order to maintain the de facto political separation of Taiwan from mainland China, the U.S. and its sort of proxies within domestic Taiwanese politics have instead adopted, a stance that Taiwan, is de facto an independent country, right? That it has, in a trans-historical sense, been separate from China, and they've really undertaken, a thoroughgoing ideological project of historical revisionism to claim that this has been the case for centuries and centuries. And it's really embedded itself in school curricula, right? It's embedded itself in the common understanding that's imparted to us by hegemonic mainstream media. And that really is the level of ideological obfuscation that we're dealing with today, and the level of, divergence from the internationally recognized legal reality.
Charles, I think it's very important to highlight the term de facto independent, because as you pointed out, the ROC Constitution itself claims that there is only one China and that Taiwan province is part of China. And if they wanted to secede or declare independence, there is actually a procedure for doing this. But the simple fact is that they have never even had the votes, even as its own entity. They have never had the votes to be able to actually formally secede. And so therefore they try and claim this, kind of de facto independence, which, as we know very clearly, is no such thing. It doesn't imply any sort of independence, but really a recolonization under U.S. hegemony. That is to say, the U.S. agenda of using Taiwan as they called it, an unsinkable aircraft carrier against China. And history shows this out. When they first left and went to Taiwan Island, the KMT fascists bifurcated, and they continued to wage hot war against China, both from Taiwan province and also from Myanmar. And so this has been a kind of continuing process of aggression that was tempered after the 1970s, where Taiwan went from being an unsinkable aircraft carrier into being a hedge against China. And now it looks like it's being remilitarized and becoming once again this unsinkable aircraft carrier and a forward base for U.S. geopolitical aggression.
Yeah, so you're absolutely right, KJ. It's important when we're looking at this history to, sort of periodize it, but also to recognize the continuities in U.S. policy from the first Cold War and now leading into the new Cold War against China. During the first Cold War, of course, the United States was wholeheartedly backing, the KMT dictatorship, the White Terror in Taiwan, the really brutal anti-communist repression domestically, on the island, as well as the use of Taiwan as a staging ground for, as you said, active attacks against mainland China, and as something of, actually a world base for anti-communism, where the World Anti-Communist League was headquartered there, and it, pulled in all of these sort of fascists and right-wing forces from across the world, really, other U.S. puppet regimes in Asia, throughout Latin America, even European neo-Nazi groups. And, the thing is that this confluence of events in the late 70s, where you had normalization between the United States and the People's Republic in Beijing, as well as a gradual move towards political opening in Taiwan itself, inaugurated for a time a period of warmer cross-strait ties, right? Of relative military disengagement, and the resumption, sort of step by step over the course of decades, of cross-strait exchanges, right? Of cross-strait trade, the resumption of direct air and sea links, and a sort of common understanding, right? A consensus that was sort of made official in 1992, that people on both sides of the strait understood themselves as Chinese, right? Albeit living under two different political systems and with somewhat different official interpretations of what that consensus was. But nonetheless, this was a period where, with at least tacit U.S. encouragement, we had pretty warm cross-strait relations, and a pretty high degree of self-identification as Chinese, right, within the Taiwanese population. And it's really been sort of an artificial and contrived ideological project to undermine that, right, at the level of education, at the level of ideology, in such a way as to prepare the ground for the remilitarization of Taiwan, for its sort of reincorporation into U.S. geostrategy in the Indo-Pacific, as a quote-unquote unsinkable aircraft carrier, and as the linchpin of what the U.S. considers the first island chain, with which its network of 400 or so bases in the region encircle China, and this, of course, is part and parcel of the new Cold War against China, which began with Obama's pivot to Asia and intensified dramatically in Trump's first term, continued unabated in Biden's single term, and which we will undoubtedly see continue to intensify as Trump re-enters office.
Yeah, Charles, that reminds me, I was, discussing this issue with an American, and he said that, I've lived on Taiwan. It's a cool place. Why don't the Chinese just leave them alone, let them do their own thing? And so I asked him inadvertently, what were you doing there in Taiwan? And he said, oh, I was stationed there. I was a military officer there. And so then I had to point out, the reason why China cannot leave, quote unquote, Taiwan province alone is the very reason why you were there, that it literally was a forward base that was used by the military, U.S. military, to wage war against China, and that it actually had nuclear weapons stationed there. And I think the other thing that's really important for people to understand is Taiwan is not simply an island, which is 90 miles from the Chinese mainland, the distance of Cuba to, say, Florida, but that it is an archipelagic state. There are 130 islands, and many of those islands are right up against the coastline, most notably Jinmen, which is, 3 kilometers away from China. It's literally as if, if there were, USSR, if the USSR had stationed not only weapons on Cuba, but that it had stationed them on Key West, for example. That's literally, the kind of geostrategic situation and threat that it presents towards China.
Yeah, that's exactly right, KJ. And it's important to note as well that these islands just immediately off the coast of mainland China, mostly off the coast of Fujian province, like Jinmen and Mazu, right? It's kind of a historical accident that they remain under de facto RS, Republic of China control at the end of the Civil War. It was really a function of the lack of amphibious, landing capacity by the communists at the time.
So let me just jump in here. So Charles, you're saying that they didn't have amphibious capacity. Actually, it was a people's army that was fighting a land war. So they actually had no naval capacity. And so these islands were taken away from them, and then the U.S. enforced that, subjugation with its own navy. So I think that's a really important point. But sorry, I interrupted you.
So yeah, that's a really great point, KJ. Yeah, it's important to emphasize just how rudimentary the technological means that the People's Liberation Army, the armed forces of the People's Republic of China, were at that time, right? And how extraordinary it was that against a force that was armed to the teeth by the United States, they were able to liberate the entirety of the mainland. But you know, they of course didn't have the capacity to go on and even fully retake these islands that were a few kilometers off the coast. Say nothing of of Taiwan Island itself, especially after it became really garrisoned, by the Chiang Kai-shek regime. And then it was actually the Korean War, right? And the outbreak of hostilities in the Korean Peninsula in 1950 that led the United States to define the preservation of the nationalist regime in Taiwan as like a core strategic interest, and to then send like the entirety of the U.S. Seventh Fleet into the Taiwan Strait so as to really crystallize that political division across the two sides of the strait. But it wound up also freezing this kind of interesting territorial setup where the ROC continues to hold these islands just off the coast, and as I said, it was just a few occasions during the 1950s, the two Taiwan Strait crises, when there was active fighting there. But the reason why, interestingly, there hasn't been active fighting in 1958, even in these locales where de facto PRC and ROC held territory are literally a few miles from each other. You can see Jinmen from Xiamen on the mainland and vice versa. The reason for that essentially is because of a de facto arrangement that the communists and the nationalists arrived at, where it was realized that actually if the PRC took these islands by force, then it would sort of further entrench the political and territorial separation of Taiwan from the mainland. And in fact, the people on those islands that are closer to the mainland have always strongly supported, the eventual aim of reunification. They strongly reject, the designs of the pro-independence separatist forces, and they recognize that for what it is, right? As essentially warmongering that is taking place at the behest of the United States and according to the dictates of the United States. And that actually is a sentiment that is a lot more common among the people of Taiwan generally than is realized. A lot of people think that were it not for China drawing these military red lines around a unilateral declaration of independence, then the island would do so overnight. And that's really not the case. If you look at polling, a solid 60+% majority has consistently been in favor of the status quo, a status quo that worked well for people on both sides of the strait for decades and decades. And, you have like maybe 20 or so percent who are in favor of gradually moving towards independence, and only about 3 or 4% that is in favor of an immediate declaration of independence. So, even though like pro-independence forces have been in government in Taiwan for the last decade or so, they realize that they themselves lack a democratic mandate, for anything of this sort. And that really, is the more meaningful constraint, I would say, than the specter that's conjured up in Western media of like an imminent sort of Chinese threat to as they put it, invade the island.
Yeah. And I think it's important also to highlight the fact that this notion of quote unquote independence really means that they would be U.S. vassals. And the DPP, which is the party which is agitating for secession, is strongly, strongly tied to the NED, National Endowment for Democracy. In fact, they flaunt their connection with the NED.
Yeah, I think it's also really important to point out that there's always discussion in the United States when talking about Taiwan independence. that there are always people that say, well, we should listen to Taiwanese people, we should listen to the lived experiences of Taiwanese people. But if you look at the actual data, the latest data from 2023 places like pro-independence, it places it as low as 4.5%. And as you mentioned, Charles, the majority of people in Taiwan at least support the status quo as it exists now. They do not support independence. But speaking of the idea of one China and reunification, at the top of this interview, you mentioned the one China policy. And I think that's something that really important to come back to, right? In the past couple of years, we've seen U.S. leaders meeting with leaders of Taiwan. And this is in direct contradiction to the one China policy, which the U.S. purportedly subscribes to. Most notably, we saw in this clip, as you see, Nancy Pelosi, who was then Speaker of the House, meeting with then leader of Taiwan, Tsai Ing-wen. So I was wondering, could you talk a little bit, about the one China policy and how these meetings, because I think most people in the United States would say, well, these are just meetings between two leaders. What's the big deal? How does this represent an escalation in tensions, in Chinese-Taiwan tensions?
Yeah, absolutely. For a little bit of background about the one China policy, this is essentially a commitment that the United States made all the way back in 1972 during President Nixon's visit to China, where in the so-called Shanghai Communique, which was a joint statement by the governments of the United States and the People's Republic of China, several years in advance of formal normalization, they said, our common understanding is that Taiwan and mainland China are part of one China, and that people on both sides of the strait are Chinese, right? This was sort of an elegant way of getting around the issue of the preservation then and now of two very different political regimes on both sides of the strait. But it nonetheless was the cornerstone of U.S. policy in this regard. And the thing is that the U.S. has always found ways to sort of get around really substantively committing to it, right? In the immediate wake of the normalization of relations with Beijing in 1979, the U.S. passed the Taiwan Relations Act, which continues to allow it to sell arms to Taiwan, right? Taiwan, as it does in many countries around the world that formally recognize the PRC, it maintains sort of like a quasi-informal office in DC that operates sort of as a substitute for a formal embassy. But these are all measures that are like quite sort of standard and that reflect the de facto reality of a separate of political separation between Taiwan and mainland China without formalizing any sort of claim to independence. And the thing is that according to these well-established protocols, which have been part of the status quo in U.S. China relations for decades, any moves by high-level U.S. officials like Nancy Pelosi as like a sitting Speaker of the House of Representatives at the time to actually meet in like a formal or quasi-formal setting with with leading officials of the Taiwan authorities constitute like a severe violation of those protocols, and very clearly a de facto move towards what could be eventual recognition of their like by the United States, right, of their legitimacy as a sort of separate governing authority. And that's what crosses a red line for the PRC, and what has made Pelosi's visit and similar moves since then actually like a qualitative escalation from where things were at before. So yeah, that's one thing to emphasize here, and another is that when it comes to sort of issues of image, right? Like even if Pelosi at the time, was not traveling to Taiwan and meeting with Tsai Ing-wen and these other officials in necessarily her official capacity, the fact that she held that office, right, is clearly meant to communicate, particularly to an interlocutor that is as vested in matters of protocol as the PRC, right? That this was the intention to sort of escalate towards like de facto and de jure recognition of the political separation of Taiwan from mainland China. And that's why, since then, since Pelosi's visit, right, which represented such a qualitative escalation, this is why, China has in some ways tried to establish a new norm where such escalations, such gratuitous violations of the existing protocol and of the letter of the One China policy, will be met with a robust response, and that has come on several occasions now, both in the immediate aftermath of her visit and twice this year, right, in response to certain intentional provocations by the newly inaugurated ROC or Taiwan president, Lai Ching-te. It's come in the form of military exercises in and around Taiwan, right, which have been sort of telegraphed well in advance, which are in some ways highly choreographed, but which send a message that this red line around so-called Taiwanese independence.
Charles, it's interesting that you mentioned Nancy Pelosi. I have a riddle for you. What do apartheid president P.W. Botha, South Korean dictator Park Chung-hee, U.S. Senator Jesse Helms, and Nancy Pelosi have in common?
I presume they all traveled to Taiwan in a semi-official capacity.
Very good, very good. Yes, and they all received Taiwan's highest medal, the Order of Propitious Clouds. It's the highest civilian medal. It's like the Congressional Medal of Honor for civilians, if you will. And so Nancy Pelosi is actually in very, very interesting company. And I think that goes back, I think that illuminates really my next question, which is that in the West, Taiwan has always been kind of put forth as this model, this virtuous model of East Asian democracy, that, the Chinese are prone to authoritarianism, but Taiwan shows that the Chinese people are capable of democracy. I mean, it's very, very offensive. And of course, it's belied by the historical fact that until 1996, Taiwan did not have an election for its leader. It was one of the most authoritarian states, brutally authoritarian states on the planet. It was a serial human rights violator. And of course, it was deeply allied, as you pointed out, with an alliance of rogue states such as South Africa and Israel and Latin American dictatorships. In fact, it exported its model of counterinsurgency to Latin America, which is why, the death squads in El Salvador were trained at Taiwan's Peitu Political Warfare Cadres Academy. But I just want us to unpack a little bit, this trope that Taiwan is some kind of model democracy, as they claim also for Israel. Is that really the case?
That's an excellent point, KJ. And I would go further and say that actually, this, apparently sharp disjuncture between the dictatorship and the so-called democratic period that Taiwan is in now and has been since, the early to mid 90s. There's actually more continuity there than people realize, because the underlying factor, the through line behind all of this is anti-communism. And in fact, I would go so far as to say that brutal anti-communist counterinsurgency, the white terror that was waged by the Chiang Kai-shek regime, its actual intent was in some ways to make Taiwan safe in some ways, quote unquote, for U.S. style democracy. What do I mean by this? I mean that the main political opposition to the KMT regime led by Chiang Kai-shek was in fact communists in Taiwan. These were not mainland Chinese communists who came over. These were people in Taiwan born and bred, right? In most cases, having grown up under Japanese colonialism and having been part of the anti movement that found its most militant form and its greatest mass base within the communist movement, right? And which was very much allied with the Communist Party on the mainland. This was the main opposition to Chiang Kai-shek's regime, right? They were the ones who organized the armed struggle in the wake of the brutal suppression of the so-called 228 uprising against KMT rule in 1947. And they were systematically wiped out in the White Terror. And what this meant was that it left a political vacuum that could be filled in a highly contrived and engineered way by a liberal opposition, which came out of the KMT itself, and whose main point of distinction with the KMT was not on the question of anti-communism, right? They're in many ways just as anti-communist, but their point of distinction was on the question of so-called Taiwanese identity and on the prospect of unification with the rest of China. So in many ways, this illusion of so-called Taiwanese democracy was engineered by the anti-communist counterinsurgency, and this is the history that needs to frame discussions of the so-called democratization of Taiwan in the 90s. Is that the condition for that was the destruction of the communist opposition and the creation of, basically a two-party or two-block anti-communist duopoly, where you have a formal alternation of power, right? You have the trappings of liberal democratic institutions, but in reality, it's all within the confines set by the U.S. And the red line that cannot be crossed for the United States is for any force to come into power in Taiwan, right? That actually would advocate for socialist reunification with the People's Republic, or even in any way like go beyond the bounds set by the United States in terms of its own approach to cross-strait policy and to foreign policy in general.
Absolutely. And, I think it's also important to point out that Taiwan's current electoral system is first past the post, which is essentially simple majority. And the current incumbent won with 40% of the vote, which in most countries would have led to a runoff. But instead, they were elected on that basis, essentially with 28% of the electorate. And most countries that are first past the post, the U.S. categorizes as authoritarian states, but it refuses to apply that to Taiwan province. But there's just one last point, I think, which is important for people to understand, is that you pointed out the World Anti-Communist League was this kind of clearinghouse for fascist and anti-communist subversion around the world. It literally brought together anti-communists from all around the planet and created a base of operations for them. And then that created this kind of space to train counterinsurgency, death squads, etc., around the world. But you point out the continuity of that, and we see this to the current moment where, for example, Israel's attacks on Lebanon, this kind of pager attack, was facilitated by a Taiwanese company. And of course, the Taiwanese company Gold Apollo says that, we had nothing to do with it. We simply subcontracted our brand to a Hungarian firm. But what company subcontracts its brand to a company that has no history of producing anything that is electronic? So that story really, raises more question than it answers. But I think this relationship between Taiwan, as I refer to it as the East Asia, as the Israel of East Asia, and Israel as the Taiwan of the Middle East, I think is something which is important to highlight and to remind our listeners of.
Yeah, this is a parallel that has been remarked upon by both imperialists and anti-imperialists in remarkably sort of parallel ways, I would say. When it comes to the imperialist perspective, you've had this image of the unsinkable aircraft carrier. This was language that was used in relation to Taiwan by Douglas MacArthur in 1950, right at the start of the Korean War, and in relation to Israel by Reagan's Secretary of State, Alexander Haig, in 1980. And I think you got to hand it to them sometimes. It is a very evocative and accurate image in that it shows just how how imperialism on a global scale instrumentalizes entire territories, entire peoples, right? And sort of conscripts them into this project of being nothing more than a forward base, right, for imperial interests, whether in East Asia specifically directed against China or against the Arab world, right, and West Asia in the case of the Israeli settler colonial regime in Palestine. On the other hand, this parallel was also recognized by Mao Zedong himself all the way back in 1965, which was the year that the People's Republic of China became the first country to establish diplomatic relations with the Palestine Liberation Organization. They sent a visiting delegation to Beijing, and he told them, quote, that imperialism is afraid of China and of the Arabs. Israel and the regime in Taiwan are bases of imperialism in Asia. You are the gate of the great continent, and we are the rear. They created Israel for you, and Taiwan for us. Their goal is the same. So that was really a recognition of the same geopolitical reality, right? But I would say more from the perspective of anti-imperial resistance, and sort of identifying of the so-called East and West Asia as really poles of resistance to that. And in fact, for Qiao Collective, I also wrote an article earlier this year that sort of opens with that quote, right? And that examines in greater detail the anti-imperialist resonances, the continued ties at both the sort of official and popular levels between China's history of socialist construction and anti-imperialist resistance, and that of Palestine and the axis of resistance in general.
I really don't think that we can talk about Taiwan without talking about the role of semiconductors. And I just want to bring it back to the new Cold War, because I do think that's something that's really important to discuss, right? The role of semiconductors. China's Made in 2025 plan, which was launched in 2015, it was a 10-year economic development initiative, which basically laid out a plan to transform the country from this manufacturing hub of cheap consumer goods to one of high-tech manufacturing and innovation, right? And they specifically identified semiconductors chips as key to this transformation. And what people may not immediately know is that Taiwan's TSMC is the world's largest semiconductor manufacturer, and it accounts for something like 56% share of the global market. And, China spends more on semiconductor chips than it does on oil. And analysts have actually called semiconductors, they have said that semiconductors are to the 21st century what oil was to the 20th century, right? And so the US has been trying to block China's access to these chips and this chip making technology because it's these chips that are vital to its technological and economic development, right? So it sees Taiwan as this strategic vulnerability in its proximity to China. So, Charles, I was wondering if you could talk a little bit more about that and, how Taiwan and Taiwan independence just it's used as the US as this pressure point in the Cold War.
Yeah, absolutely. I think it's interesting to examine the history of how Taiwan came to occupy such a key place in the supply chain for semiconducting chips globally. TSMC, the Taiwan Semiconductor Manufacturing Company, was founded, I believe, in 1989 by Morris Chang, who actually was originally, he was Taiwanese. He originally was at Texas Instruments in the United States, and he basically, came to the Taiwanese authorities at the time, who were, in the process of, it was still a KMT one party regime, but it was in the process of liberalization, on these terms that, as I mentioned, were very favorable to the United States, with a proposition to, essentially create a firm that whose sole purpose was to be a so-called factory for these chips. So, like other companies with TSMC, their designs, and TSMC would just manufacture them. And they got very, very good at this, right? And about half of their seed funding actually came from the Taiwanese government itself. But this is also, of course, a measure of sort of national industrial policy and industrial development that could not have happened without the explicit approval of the United States. And this is because the U.S. simultaneously at that time was in the process of, trying to move up the value chain of semiconductor production and sort of, selectively offshoring parts of that process that are earlier, right? Like, a lot of the precursors, like the actual fabrication, to close allies. So, this meant Japan and then South Korea and then Taiwan, right? So this was all part of a more global project that happened very much under the auspices of the U.S. and was intended then and now to keep pretty much this entire process of the manufacture of these chips, which, as you point out, like, are a multi-trillion-dollar industry, and in many ways the lifeblood of the modern global economy, entirely under the thumb of the U.S. and its allies. So, that's how Taiwan came to occupy this particular position. And it's only been in fairly recent years that, this has since been reframed as kind of like a strategic vulnerability, right, by the United States, precisely because of how much the U.S. government has played up the threat of armed reunification of Taiwan with the mainland by the People's Republic of China, right? And this is how you have arrived at this formulation now of TSMC as the so-called Silicon Shield, quote unquote. Somehow defending Taiwan from the prospect of military attack from the mainland, because TSMC's sort of key role in this supply chain also means it's deeply imbricated with the mainland and its sort of need, with mainland China and its need for these high-end chips as well, right? As you mentioned, Amanda, TSMC manufactures about 56 to 60% of the world's like total supply of chips. But when it comes to high-end chips with like the most densely packed components or process nodes, as they're called, that proportion goes up to 90%, right? And that's a manufacturing capacity where China is still, most would estimate, 3 to 5 years behind the cutting edge, and where the U.S., as part of its trade war and its efforts to really economically underdevelop and de-develop China, right, has tried to systematically cut it out of these supply chains. This is actually like a quite self-defeating strategy for TSMC itself, because their biggest customer, as a country, is in fact mainland China itself, right? But it's created this weird situation where the U.S. sees this abiding strategic interest in Taiwan, not just geographically, but because of its crucial role in this industrial supply chain as well, and where you in fact have had multiple high-level U.S. politicians intimate that if China is on the verge of militarily trying to reunify Taiwan, then the U.S. will itself go in and blow up TSMC in order to stop them from doing so, right? And this, I think, just it shows again, just the callousness and the really cavalier way in which imperialism, conscripts entire peoples, right? And their industries, the entire the really baseline for their modern economic life, right, into its project of geopolitical hegemony. And it's also caused a lot of tensions, with, in fact, the authorities in Taiwan themselves, right, where for nationalistic reasons, they then have to say, to these high-level politicians, right, in their main imperial sponsor, that look, if you want to attack our semiconductor manufacturing plants, then we will have to defend them from you, right? So it's a contradiction that in many ways serves to undermine, I would say, the long-term interests of U.S. imperialism, because of the sort of grotesque militarization of not just the island, but even this strategic industry by the United States. And it's already led, right, to for example, the CHIPS Act and these efforts by the United States to reshore semiconductor manufacturing to the U.S., right, to essentially strong arm TSMC into building a facility in Arizona, which then has led to all these knock-on consequences of cost overruns, of culture shock, right, from U.S. employees at this new TSMC plant, and this attempt by the Biden administration, right, to pursue a kind of industrial policy and a reindustrialization, when it comes to the semiconductor manufacturing process in particular, use the threat of war with China as a pretext. It really has sort of run aground domestically and is, causing a lot of problems with, their own proxy political forces in Taiwan. So that's going to be interesting to keep an eye on, because it could be one manifestation of actually the U.S.'s imperial overreach, harming the interests of U.S. imperialism, even in Taiwan, which has to date in recent decades been one of their most reliable proxies.
Well, Charles, we won't keep you much longer, but for those who are interested in learning more about Taiwan or learning more about the Qiao Collective, where can they turn to check out more of your work?
Yeah, absolutely. So Qiao Collective is, we have a website, qiaocollective.com. Qiao is spelled Qiao, collective.com. We also have the same handle across all major social media, Instagram, Twitter /X, just at Qiao Collective. And, we sort of had a bit of a 2-year publishing hiatus that we broke earlier this year, actually, with the publication of the Taiwan resource list. And we've since followed that up with some more content. For example, shortly in the wake of that, we published a great translation from my comrade Kevin in Qiao of an article from 1987 by a Taiwanese journalist about the little-known history of the underground communist movement in Taiwan. That's called A Beautiful Century. It's also on our website. And of course, on the question of China and Palestine, we've been very active there as well. I already mentioned my article, which came out in March, The Gates of the Great Continent, which is up there on the website. And just recently, like a bit over a week ago, we published another translation by Kevin, this time, of a detailed analysis by like a Chinese vlogger, a Chinese political vlogger, really breaking down the autobiographical novel of Yahya Sinwar, the martyred leader of Hamas, and examining sort of the dialectic of collaboration and counterinsurgency and resistance that his story tells in relation to that of the Chinese liberation struggle, that was really led by the Communist Party, but truly, took the form of this national unity front against the Japanese invasion during World War II. So that is a really, really interesting piece. I definitely learned a lot from it. And I would encourage anyone who's interested to check all of that out on our website and follow us on all your platforms.
To end the show, we have this fun video. There's really not much of an intro needed. It's just a fun, festive video of a video that went viral on TikTok a couple weeks ago, and it's just a scene from a Chinese-Lebanese wedding. And hope you enjoy. If you like this episode, make sure to like, share, and subscribe. And we'll see you next week on the China Report.